Okay, well, good evening, everyone. And I can't see very much of you, but good evening. And thank you indeed for inviting me to give this talk to you tonight. Just a little bit of background, perhaps, just to fill out a little bit of what Simon was saying. I've been a member of the Kent Field Club for the best part of 40 years now, incredibly. I come at this from purely the angle of an enthusiastic amateur. I've no scientific training or scientific background. I just love natural history, really. And since I started, I've sort of sped through all sorts of different aspects of natural history. As Simon said, I did a lot of lichens in the 80s and 90s. But I mean, I've got a lot to thank the Kent Field Club for, especially expanding my knowledge of botany and fungi and then lichens, which I took up in quite a big way. But then in the early years of the new century, I started on leaf mines, which I enjoyed very much. It was a fascinating study. It crosses boundaries, of course, because it is the larvae of certain species of Lepidoptera, Hymenoptera, Diptera and Coleoptera that form leaf mines. And in a way that led quite naturally about 10 years ago onto galls, plant galls, because a lot of plant galls, again, are created by the larvae of certain species of Lepidoptera, Coleoptera, Hymenoptera and Diptera. But there are also other ways in which plant galls are formed, and the whole thing is a lot more diverse than, I suppose, looking at leaves and finding the mines on leaves. There is a great diversity of form in plant galls, and what I want to do this evening is to try and introduce you to that great diversity. So there's going to be plenty of pretty pictures as we go through. Now we should be able to go on to the next slide. I wonder why it's not working. Ah, okay. It lets me do it on screen. Right. So what is a plant gall? That's the first thing to discuss. And the Bible of British plant galls, or Cecidoology as it's known, states the following definition. A gall is an abnormal growth produced by a plant under the influence of another organism. It involves enlargement and or proliferation of the host cells or vascular tissue, and provides both protection and nutrition for the gall causer. If it doesn't enlarge and proliferate the cells of the host, then it's not a gall. There we go. So yeah, I mean that sort of has occurred again on the next slide. But the last paragraph there is any modification in the tissue of a plant. This is another way of looking at it, really. A plant gall is any modification in the tissue of a plant brought about by the attack, or attack's probably not quite the right word, of a gall-causing agent. The gall-causing agents attack the plant in such a way that the modification is recognizable as being brought about by that agent and no other. So in other words, when you see a gall, it is indicative of a particular species of gall-causing agent. Now, that doesn't mean to say that there are not other creatures within the gall, but initially it is brought about by an attack by a gall-causing agent. So when you see a gall, you know which species is causing that gall. So plant galls should be viewed as the response of the plant to an attack by a gall-causing agent. The response being the same every time that the plant is attacked by that species. Right. So how does the plant get modified? Well, in all sorts of different ways, and the purpose of the picture slides, which will be coming up throughout this talk, are to show you those very different ways in which the galls may be formed. So, a gall may be recognized by the fact that it is a swelling in the stem or in the buds of the leaves or the flowers. There can be rolling of the leaf, rolling inwards, rolling outwards as far as that goes, or just the leaf margin rolling. Galls can be formed by fungal infestations. You might find the shoot tips ending in what are so-called artichoke galls, because they resemble artichokes, of course. Additional growths, such as pouches and pimples, of varying sizes. Abnormal hairiness of the part of the plant that's been infected. So what are the gall-causing agents? Okay, insects from these orders in the first instance, Lepidoptera, micro moths in fact, Diptera, the Hymenoptera, the gall wasps, and the Coleoptera, and indeed representatives of the same orders as in the leaf mining section of this presentation. This presentation was once part of a longer one, which included the leaf mines, that's why I say that. But in addition to those gall-causing agents from those orders, you've got mites, which cause galls, aphids, psyllids and scale insects, and talking about the fungal infestations, rusts and smuts. Bacteria are thought to cause galls, viruses as well, and even a small number of other plants, notably perhaps mistletoe. And some of that information there is repeated. But in the middle there, it says that fungal galls are almost exclusively from the Ascomycetes and Basidiomycetes. So that's perhaps something to bear in mind. And some galls may be subterranean. For example, Zestophanes potentiali, for example, occurring on the roots of plants such as creeping cinquefoil. So although it does actually have a form that appears above ground as well, that particular gall is probably most easily found by digging creeping cinquefoil up. If it's one of your garden weeds, you might find swellings on the roots which indicate the presence of that gall. No, they're not far down, but they are subterranean. Yes, many galls, just like the leaf mines, are recognizable even when they're past their best and indeed be quite old. But you do need to examine sometimes the creature within to be certain of the identification. And of course, the position is complicated by the fact that other larvae may enter the galls. So you've got other organisms inside, which are probably also feeding, well, I'm sure that they're feeding off the tissue, the tissue of the plant in the same way as the primary inhabitants of the galls. Now these creatures are called inquilines, and they're probably mostly fairly harmless to the gall causer, but rather more harmful are certain parasitoids, and even more parasitoids with the prey on those parasitoids. So you can have within a gall quite a remarkable collection of creatures. Right, so let's start with some of the pictures. And this is talking about swellings in the stems. And this one is not a particularly common one, but Mompha sternipinella is a micro moth. And it does gall the stems of rosebay willow herb. It is not particularly common. A much commoner one will be this one in the stem of creeping thistle, Urophora cardui. And I think this is probably a gall that comes under notice quite readily by the naturalist going around and observing, because it's really quite a chunky swelling. And this is the a tephritid fly. This is Urophora cardui. I've got a picture in a moment coming up of the adult. This is a gall you can easily recognize later on in the year when it's gone all brown and hard on the old plants of the creeping thistle, because that swelling remains. There's the adult, fearsome looking creature, if it was as big as that, of course. And then still with stem swellings, you've got the plume moth on hemp agrimony. That's the plant that it chooses, causes a distinct swelling at the sort of leaf junctions, or just below the leaf junctions, and the hole there is the exit hole of the creature. This one is another species of fly, the swollen leaf stalk on aspen, Contarinea petioli. It's again a fairly distinctive one when you see it, and fairly easy to find because it's quite chunky, quite big. On broom, in the spring, you get a swollen bud, Asphodilla seraphamni, with a little bit of a sort of tip there. It's not quite the right shape. It's got a little bit of a tip there, which helps to distinguish it. And at the same time on broom, you've got Asphodilla ulysses, the swollen flower bud on gorse. Seems to be getting a bit rarer, but now is about the time really to look out for those swollen flower buds. And you know, if you open them up, you can find inside the larva of this particular fly. And more swollen flower buds on bird's foot trefoil, Contarinea loti, and similarly on tufted vetch, where the flower bud swells in a rather bulbous way. I seem to have missed this one in recent years, and I do suspect that some of these, the occurrence of some of these galls are quite cyclical, so that they, they go scarce for a number of years. And this we found in Lamberhurst churchyard. I think that there is below the flowering part. It's a swollen flower bud, which won't in fact open. But that is because that is infected by this fly, which is called Dacinura. Yes, that's the name, Dacinura cardaminis. Where are we? And there it is again. And the gall inside and the red coloured larvae there are able to be seen. So when is the best time to look for galls? Well, there are certainly species that you can see in spring. For example, the galls I showed you on broom there and on gorse, they are very much spring species. But perhaps the best time to look is in late summer and in the early autumn months through to about the end of October. Although, as I say, some galls can be recognised later on, throughout the winter, where the plants remain fairly robust, even though they're dead. A number of species on oak have quite different generations, quite different looking generations. And I got some slides later that will show that. You wouldn't believe that they were the same species because they form a different looking gall in spring to what they form in autumn. And that's particularly so of a number of species that develop on oak. But some more different forms of gall formation here. Dacinura critigae, the button top gall, as it's sometimes called, occurs very readily on cut, where hawthorn has been cut, and is characterized by a certain sort of curling up of the leaf, but also by little projections on the top of the leaf, which don't look unlike, in a way, the isidia that you find on some lichens, really, except they're a bit bigger. And the rivet gall occurs on dogwood. Those swellings there on the underside of a dogwood leaf, which can sometimes go a very startling red colour. That is most commonly found, really, where dogwood is growing on the downs. For example, on the North Downs at Fackenden Lane, there is a good place to find that particular species. It's not on dogwood everywhere, mostly on chalky soils. And then you've got the leaf rolls. There is, just about visible here, the margin of that leaf of hawthorn is rolled, and this leaf roll contains mites. It's a mite gall. can be quite difficult to see, quite difficult to find, because you're talking about a small leaf and you're talking about a small gall on a small leaf. However, if there is a particularly good colony, if you like, of them, then lots of leaves can be found with the rolls, and it looks quite impressive. I think we've got here actually two small ones here as well. And Dacinura irregularis is to be found on sycamore and maple. This sort of contorts the leaf, and that's a fly. And the insect, the larva itself, can be found among those folds, but usually only for a very short time in the year. And luckily, though, the leaf retains the shape that it took on when galled, and allowing you to identify. More leaf rolls here. This one on the left here, on Falsa casea, is a relatively new gall. It hasn't been in the country more than about 12 years. I think the first records were about 2008. And then it was quickly found in many places, going well up, sort of from the south, going northwards. But unfortunately, in the last few years, it seems to have declined again. Another leaf roll forming a very distinctively coloured rollover of an oak leaf, Macrodiplosis pustularis, and the fold is very flat to the surface onto which it is folded, and it has that very distinctive green speckling on it. That gets browner when it's old, but it's still possible to identify it at a later stage when it's no longer functional as a gall. Then pouch galls. Here they are on alder and beech, as the one on alder. It's just these little pouches. They're mites living in there. And on beech, Hartigiola and Ulipes, there, and there. They look very similar, but they are different species, growing on alder and beech, respectively. Again, these are mite galls that tend to be found in the second half of the year. The one on beech in particular, takes a long time to mature. So September is probably the best time to look for it. And then you've got other mites which cause the plant to produce abnormal hairiness. Now, this is a home oak leaf, and you can see that the little folds here, where the leaf has been seems to pressed up from underneath. And here are the corresponding patches of hairs. The lens will show you that they are very tightly packed hairs in which the mites live. And these patches are called erinia. This sort of gall is common on all sorts of plants. For example, there's one on walnut, which causes very big humps on the walnut leaf. And then once again, you turn underneath and you can see the hairs. I took this photograph. I think it was on Salad Bonnet. Absolutely sure, but it does look like it, and that you can see that the whole plant there really is covered with these hairs, which distorts the whole thing. And here's another mite gall on a lime leaf, and rather colourful, that one. And there, as mite galls forming pimples and pouches. Here's a lovely one that you find on maple leaves. Lots and lots and lots of them scattered all over the surface. And it's lovely because it's called Assyria myriadium, a myriad of these pouches. And here's another one, rather rarer on lime, called Phytopes erinotes. And aphids particularly seem to be the galls that you find particularly on elm and on poplar, and also on spruce, with these rather remarkable many-chambered galls of the adelges on Sitka spruce, mostly that species. This one is old, but it's still recognizable. And here's some aphid galls on poplar, which are fairly familiar. I mean, I remember these, wondering what these were, back when I was sort of pre-teenage, and on the poplar trees in my own garden at Peterborough. We had two great big poplars in the garden, and these galls, I seem to remember, were all over them. Pemphigus bursarius, these are aphid galls, and Pemphigus even more familiar, I think, is Spirotheca, which has these whorls, almost like a snail shell. Pemphigus bursarius and Pemphigus Spirotheca, commonly found on poplar, and often found actually on leaves of poplar that have fallen to the ground and still visible on those fallen leaf petioles. Now some fungal galls. Puccinia malvacearum. This is to be found on common mallow, hollyhock as well. And all these brown spots refer to the fungus Puccinia malvacearum. And even these can look quite different. Taphrina toscanettii really does swell the leaves of alder. And the pocket plums, as they're called, are fairly well known because they're quite conspicuous on prunus. And then the red tongues on Taphrina olnei, which used to be a little bit uncommon here in the southeast, but has now in recent years become a lot more frequent, and it should be looked for on older cones in anywhere really. Fiery tongues. That seems to be another. Okay, that's not the Sputnik gall. It should be that one. And that belongs there. This has earned the nickname the Sputnik gall on rose, Diplolepis nervosa. It's a smaller version, although not quite the same as the famous Robin's pincushion gall. But you can see why it's been termed Sputnik. And this one is a gall that you can find on common fleabane. And this photograph was taken in the winter. And what happens with this gall is, like quite a number of galls, the gall forms below the flower head. Then, and there are versions of this, if you like, not the same species, but versions like this on things like spear thistle, on knapweed, on wild carrot too. And pressing down on the flower head of this species and finding it's very hard when you press down is indicative of a gall. So they're not easily seen unless you know how to look for them. But with the common fleabane flowers die, it leaves behind in the winter this dark, hard head, which is the old gall. It does seem to be an increasing species, though it is a very southeastern gall, this. It's very worthwhile looking out for me and getting more records of this one. Although, as I say, it is increasing, but it's always nice to find it. I had in my garden down here at Rye, I'm sorry, I'm no longer Kent, I'm afraid, but in my garden down here at Rye, a common fleabane turned up. It's as a weed, I suppose. I didn't plant it. And I was delighted to find, though, I allowed it to grow and flower because it's quite a pretty flower, really. And then I discovered that there were actually these galls on it in my own garden, Myopetes inulites centerici. Very long name. There is a relative of that species on golden samphire around the estuaries of the Thames estuary and so on. And then we're coming to some oak galls. Oak is a species of tree which harbours many, many different types of gall. And one of the most famous is the oak apple. Very conspicuous, and that is the oak apple, very fresh. And here it is where an old one has been cut to show the many chambers there in which the larva has fed. But it also, being a big gall, it also attracts all sorts of other creatures inside as well. And here are examples of two of the artichoke galls that I talked about. This bunching of the leaves into this artichoke form on yew, Taxomai taxi, that's another fly, whereas Andricus, this Andricus here is a gall wasp, so it belongs to the Hymenoptera. And quite a distinctive thing that is. Here's Triosa remota on a leaf of oak. There's the hump on the upper side, and on the underside, the scale insect or the psyllid inside the depressions there. There we go. Again, a more tricky one to find that because it's small and it could easily be overlooked. And then going on to talk about these second generation oak galls. Now, there are many wasp galls on oaks have 2 generations annually, in spring and late summer. And there is usually a considerable difference in the appearance of the same species in the spring generation, which is the sexual generation, male and female, from how they appear in the later generation, which is female only. And that's called the agamic generation. And sometimes these galls make use of actually different species of oak in the 2 generations. For example, the sort of English oak, pedunculate oak in the spring generation, and moving to Turkey oak in one of the other generations. Or they might make use of a different part of the plant, perhaps buds or catkins in the spring and leaves later on. The autumn generation is often much easier to find. Not only is it the time that most people are looking for galls, but they tend to be more conspicuous. I don't know why that is. So you've got Neuroterus quercus picarum, a very common gall indeed, or should be a very common gall indeed. I say that because they do have years in which they seem to be virtually absent, and next year they're back again in vast numbers. You've got these currant shaped galls in spring on the catkins, but here on the underside of the leaves in the autumn is the autumn generation of the same species. More oak galls here. Cynips quercus folii and Cynips longiventris, the striped pea gall. Quite impressive, but tending to be on the underside of the leaves. Sometimes these galls will be found because there is a discolored patch on the top surface, and you turn them over and you might find these galls underneath. Some more galls found on oak are the so-called oyster gall on usually on the midrib or another branch of the midrib, again on an oak leaf. And then there's the famous knopper gall on the acorns of oak. Thought at one time to be a great problem, likely to cause the death of oaks simply because they were making use of the acorns. But in fact, some years they can be quite scarce. And it's no good killing the oaks because the creature will not survive either. Now, yeah, that's wrong. I mean, that's in the wrong place. Okay, there we go, that's right. This I showed you before, Neuroterus quercus picarum. These are called spangle galls, very distinctive with that red speckling over them. And the ones on the right, sometimes very common too, not quite as common as the Quercus picarum, but Neuroterus numismalis, known as the silk button gall. Okay. Andricus glandulae, is an autumnal form. Again, it's a gall which is a little bit uncommon. There's plenty of it in Knoll Park. I do know that, because I've seen plenty of it there myself. And your marble gall with an exit hole, Androcus collari as it's known. But again, very distinctive. And that can sometimes be found on fallen oak leaves. It's quite a sturdy gall, so it doesn't disappear in a hurry. And that sort of brings us to some books. This book by Michael Chinnery, A Photographic Guide, it sold very well, in fact, because it's an excellent introduction to galls with lots of nice colourful photographs. This is, however, the Bible. And I think one of the reasons, actually, that I suddenly thought about 2008, I thought I'd like to take up galls, was simply because I had a copy of this in my bookshelves, which I'd hardly looked at. I thought, oh, well, I'm going to try and make use of this book. And it's an excellent book. It's sometimes known as the keys to plant galls. I think that's important to point that out, because it is a book in which the galls are keyed out quite nicely. Yes, this was just to point out that even the Bible has to change. We research into galls is going on all the time. And what is a gall and what isn't? Well, that can be a fairly fluid science, really. Some species, which were in previous editions of the Bible, are no longer considered to be true galls because they're not modifying the tissue of the plant in a way that you would expect from galls. While others have been elevated to gall status and thus are now included within the book. It's interesting, actually, that, and Joyce Pitt would probably confirm this, there are Puccinia species which are considered to be galls and Puccinia species which are not considered to be galls. For example, I think I'm right in saying there's a Puccinia that you find on the leaves of cuckoo pint, arum, but it's not considered a gall, but other species of Puccinia are. But then that's how galls work. There are many species of Diptera which do not form galls, but there are many species of Diptera, the Dasyneura genus, for example, which do form a lot of galls. So what is a gall and what isn't a gall tends to vary a bit. Well, so yes, that was really sort of crept in from my previous presentation, but useful gall websites are there. And a plug for the British Plant Gall Society. The gall study is a rather niche study, but the Gall Society does produce a ceccidology twice a year, and it is a very readable journal. For example, I'm also a member of the Teratological Society, the Fern Society, if you like, and they do tend to produce very learned publications through the year, which quite difficult for the sort of ordinary field naturalists to take in. But ceciology, which occurs twice a year, is a very readable thing, and you've got useful tips to help newcomers along, and lots of pictures too. And they do produce other publications as well. The keys, which I showed you in the British Plant Galls, the Bible, that was produced by the Field Studies Council, but it was compiled by experts within the British Plant Gall Society, and they're currently drawing up now a new edition of the keys, coming a decade after the last edition. And we have a series of day field meetings each year, and every weekend, or every year in September, we go away for a residential weekend to hold the AGM, and of course, inevitably, make excursions into the nearby countryside to search for galls, and then you get a lot of help from the experts. It's wonderful how these societies, how the experts, the scientists, will join these societies and help others along, help the enthusiastic amateur along to progress their knowledge. I mean, that is something that I think is so wonderful about the Field Club, the Kent Field Club as well. And finally, a few more pretty pictures. I'm sure we should end with some. Andricus gemmeus occurs on oak trunks. It is a tiny little thing, very delicate, quite handsome though under the lens, overlooked. But again, this has not been in the UK that long, but is being increasingly found. Andricus ariaeus, the ram's horn, and not so recent an arrival as the one on the left, gemmeus, but in fact I think was only found in Berkshire for the first time in 1997. So it's a relative newcomer, as indeed quite a few of these oak galls are. There's a pimple on ash, Dasyneura fraxinia, easily overlooked because it's much the same colour as the green leaf, but as it darkens later on in the year, it's more noticeable. And this sort of swelling of the petiole and the similarly named Dasyneura fraxinae also on ash. This is a curious one. Mites form these wavy branches in the underside of the leaves of hornbeam, and Triosa urticae does this to common nettle. Dog's mercury will be found, some of these bright orange patches of a fungal infestation. And here's another fly gall, these pouches on meadowsweet. Hedgehog gall on oak. Again, a fairly recent arrival, I think about 1990, and found initially in Regent's Park on oak there. It has spread, but not quite as fast as some other new oak species, but a rather attractive one, the hedgehog gall for obvious reasons, and a mite gall here on alder, underside leaves of alder, Acolytus brevitarsus, those the mites living among the hairs of those hairy patches there. And lighthouse gall on ground ivy. Well, that's the lighthouse. It's the only example of the gall left on the leaf. But these telltale holes, actually, that's probably another one there. Oh, and there. But these holes left by the lighthouse when it falls away are very distinctive. So you can tell the presence of the gall, I always like to say this, the presence of the gall by its absence. And the leaves of cleavers or goosegrass strongly rolled by another mite gall. A relative newcomer is Neuroterus saliens. I think it's now pseudo-Neuroterus saliens, in fact, on Turkey oak, along the midrib of the leaf. And this is a lovely one. You wouldn't know. This is the seed from a birch. And what you have to do to find these is to get a nice piece of white paper, take an old catkin of birch and gently rub all the seeds off it so that it's just a spindle left. And if you see a swelling on that spindle, that is another gall from this Semudobia group. But then look at the seeds as they've fallen onto your white paper and sort them out. And if they've got a little pit like this, then that's the gall of Semudobia betuli. And there is another one, not dissimilar to it, but the other one, Semudobia tarda, does not have the wings on the seed, or the wings are reduced to a very narrow area at the edge of the seed. But that is, you just don't realize that they're there. But you can find them on the by rubbing the seeds off in the autumn, or the early autumn, off a birch catkin. It's lovely to find those. Many seeds will fall, but only a small number are likely to be actually galled. But it's nice to find them when you do. Dasyneura odorati on sweet violet rolls the edges of the leaf in and creates a lot of hair. And on eucalyptus, again, a species whose precise identity has not yet been determined. Ophellimus maskellii is thought to be on eucalyptus. These numerous little pouches on a eucalyptus leaf. But once again, rather like the mine on the false acacia, the gall on the false acacia, this seems to have got much less common in recent years after going through a period of great expansion and great frequency. It now seems to be much less so. A mite gall on birch known as the birch big bud. There's a similar thing on hazel, by the way. And Puccinia urticata can do this to nettle, rather colourful. But when the infestation is heavy, it will certainly distort the leaves and indeed the stem of the whole plant. A lovely gall, urn-like on tansy, on the leaves here, but also pushing up through the flower heads there. And a rather distinctive gall colour-wise on wild carrot. And this is a nice one to find too, but you do have to select a few stems of bristly ox tongue and get into the stems to find the yellow larvae of this species of gall. There's supposed to be a very small exit hole on the stem of the plant as well. I've never been able to find that, and you really only can locate the species by splitting the stems of bristly ox tongue. Again, it's a gall which seems to be going through a period of relative scarcity at the moment. I was finding it on almost every plant as I walked along a riverside down here in, it's near Small Hythe actually, so that it was Kent, and I found it almost every plant. But it seems to be going through a scarcer period now. That's on corn sow thistle, perennial sow thistle. And this again is like the one on the common fleabane. This is one where the gall is rather hidden in a hardened, swollen base of the flower. And again, if you could dare to press hard down on a spear thistle flower head, and it's hard when you press down on the flower head. This is because a gall is formed there, a hard gall, in which there are chambers where the larvae are to be found. There's the famous poisonous ergot on grass, and a swelling in the stem of dwarf gorse is actually a coleopterous species there, a weevil in there. Coming towards the end now, a mite gall on an immature catkin of hazel. So this can be found in the autumn, in the late autumn, when the catkins of the next year are already formed. But you see how this has distorted this catkin. And that's a mite gall. And here I put in another photo of Assyria myriadium on maple, which has a single gall of Assyria macrotrichus right in the middle there. A Culops fuchsii is a mite gall that's recently arrived on fuchsia, much to the alarm of gardeners, I'm afraid. But it doesn't really survive normal winters in Britain, which is maybe a mercy to them. Some Puccinias are really quite common, and wherever you find Alexanders growing, you're likely to find the Puccinia infecting it. And Triosa centrantheon red valerian, this was once rare, it now seems to be much, much commoner on any red valerian plants growing on walls or in gardens. The witch's broom on birch, which is formed by a great proliferation of small branches and twigs in an almost ball-like shape. Nail galls on lime, they're mite galls. They're very familiar. They're galls which people do notice quite readily. And so, as is this one on Germander speedwell, this hairy gall forming on the buds. And I think this is the last slide coming up now. Yes. Dacinura urticae on common nettle. Not actually a terribly good photograph, that one really. Especially in the autumn, on leaves of common nettle. It could be found all over the surface, like there and there, but particularly in the base of the leaf, sometimes on both sides of the petiole. Dacinera urticae. Okay, fine. That's that. Now I understand that people